lecturer. It's Jane O'Brien. And the last time I was speaking with Jane, it was a number of months ago, and she was telling me that she was doing her PhD in social history in Limerick University. Galway, University College Galway, NUIG, correct? Anyway, she reminded me this evening that she was no longer a student, but that she has qualified and got her PhD. So we give her a round of applause. I spoke to Kate and I expected great things. Now I expect greater things. Jane is an O'Brien. She comes from Anderson County Clare, and indeed would have a legacy to the Royal O'Briens. Conor O'Brien of Molan Castle, 18th Earl of
18th Baron
in Chiquin, and we'll see what unfolds here this evening in relation to her talk. I know there'll be lots of questions, and Jane will be around afterwards to join us from some little tidbits, and indeed if you have other questions, we'll be more than happy to answer them. So without further ado, Jane O'Brien.
And thank you, Shane. Hello and welcome for visitors. I don't know, it's a mixture of Irish people and American and all over maybe. So I hope you enjoy this little lecture that I've put together for this evening. It's kind of quite a high level look really at, well, I got all the C's in anyway, clans and castles and culture in County Clare. So yeah, so just give you a little bit of an overview, I suppose, really, of the history of the ODs and how they fit into the history of Ireland and County Clare as well. I know that tomorrow you're going to be doing a more detailed walk out in Dysert Castle with Dick Cronin, so you'll learn, a lot more about, I suppose, the specifics of the ODs and Dysert and the battle there tomorrow. So, but yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy this evening's lecture anyway. So I'm going to start at the very beginning, really. So looking back at early Ireland and going right back, I suppose Ireland was first inhabited about 10,000 years ago. But I guess for about 8,000 of those years, we really know very little about the people that lived here. I mean, they did leave behind them, some beautifully decorated and precisely calibrated tombs and burial grounds. And the image here is from Newgrange, which is kind of the jewel in the crown of Ireland's, burial tombs in County Meath. But and it's these go back a very long time, I suppose. You're looking at about 6,000 years old. So they're older than the pyramids in Egypt, older than Stonehenge. And, we have our own Culnabone Dolmen here in County Clare as well. But the people that built these, about their culture and their hopes, I suppose, their ambitions and their religion and their society, we know very little, really. We can only wonder, I suppose. And then moving a little bit forward from that, pre-Christian Ireland was dominated by the Celtic culture. So the Celtic language, laws, and religion. So the Celts, ancient Europeans would have moved to Ireland around 700 BC. And established themselves then by about 400 BC. And by the 1st century AD, they've kind of firmly established in Ireland. And they're the language, the Celtic language, which of course was dominant in Ireland up until the 18th century here. I suppose the Great Famine would have seen maybe the real end of the Irish language. But it's still spoken, of course, in Ireland today, and we have, a Gael Skull, an Irish-speaking school in Ennis here, where the children all learn through Irish. So those kinds of things keep the language alive. And you have, of course, the Gaeltacht regions, or Irish-speaking regions, often along the west coast of Ireland. And then the laws, I mean, of Celtic Ireland, the Brehon laws, they had a very sophisticated system. I suppose, you know, the language at the time, the Celtic language was written down quite early, and then also you had the ancient laws around the 8th century. They would have written down the old Brehon laws from earlier times. And these are wonderful, gives a wonderful insight into how society was structured at that time. And they were very progressive in many ways, the old Brehon laws. I mean, yes?
Is that in Ogham?
Yeah. So the Ogham stones is where they would have originally written, the language on the stones. And then after that, finally, you know, would have written it down on manuscripts or whatever. So you do sometimes, you find those Ogham stones with the inscriptions on.
How early did Ogham?
I think they were about 4th century, yeah. And then, so very early literature really. And the law tracts, you know, they're incredibly sophisticated, I suppose, and, you know, and quite a lot of them. And they showed a society that was very law-abiding. So they had the Brehons, or judges, who would have overseen law and order at that time. And it was very much to do with not crime and punishment, but more retribution. So you would compensate people for wrongdoings. Animals were kind of currency, of course, in the old Brehon laws. So you would have to pay somebody. For example, bees were very important in ancient Ireland, and they were so important there was a whole load of laws written down just about bees. So, for example, if you were stung by a bee, and you didn't retaliate by killing the bee, you would be entitled to a meal of honey as your compensation. However, if you died from bee stings, the owner of the beehive would have to compensate your family with 2 hives of bees. So that's an example of the type of toing and froing that happened with the Brehon laws. But I mean, they would have recognized equality between sexes, and they would have been very conscious of the environment. So in many ways, very ahead of their time, I suppose. And those Brehon laws, as we'll see, would have existed for some time alongside the English laws in Ireland as well at a later time. And then the religion, of course, the Celtic religion was pagan religion, where they worshipped many gods, and you had the Druids, Celtic Druids there. So that was Celtic Ireland, I suppose. And unlike Britain, the Romans had not conquered Ireland. So we never had the Romans here. But of course there was, trade with Roman Britain and interactions that way. And, there was, St. Patrick was, at that time, he was from Roman Britain, and he was kidnapped by Irish raiders and brought over to Ireland. I mean, the Christians were in Ireland by about the 5th century AD, and there was others, but of course the most famous was St. Patrick, and he spent 6 years in Ireland. Then he went back to Britain, where he became a bishop, returned to his family, became a bishop, and returned to Ireland. But he's, of course, credited with bringing Christianity. And after that time, I suppose the 6th century and after saw many monasteries being built then in Ireland. So, including the community at Dysert, which you'll go out to tomorrow, near the O'D stronghold, which was built by St. Tola in 700 AD. And the monastic sites then, Christianity, of course, had a huge influence in Ireland. The old pagan festivals became, were readopted as Christian festivals, and the monasteries became kind of powerhouses of culture at that time, and the Irish monks became very well known for their piety, but also their command of Latin and their beautiful manuscripts and their high crosses and their metalwork. So, I mean, you've probably heard of the Book of Kells, which is one of the most famous that was produced in the 9th century, apparently by teenage boys, which was interesting for me, having 3 teenage boys at home. I couldn't really imagine them producing something like a Book of Kells. So it makes you wonder how our cultures have changed, over time. But so the Vikings, of course, then, I know we're going quite quickly through a lot of periods of Irish history here, but the Viking era, then the Vikings came, the Norsemen from the north, seafaring warriors, and they were really here for about 300 years, from the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. But you also had, of course, the Gaelic Irish kings, and the O'Briens were, for this region, part of the Dalgash, who were a Gaelic Irish tribe, and they were a very powerful group in Ireland during the 10th century. So I'm going to focus a little bit on them and the O'Ds. And I suppose Brien was perhaps the best known king from that dynasty. Brien is well known in Ireland for having famously defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1040. And of course, O'Brien, OD, it's like son of Brien, son of Brien Boru. And of course, the historic seat of that tribe is now, as she was saying, Dromoland Castle out the road, and the current day chief of that clan then would be Conor O'Brien, who traces right back to the High King Brien Boru. So the 18th Baron Inchiquin is the formal title that he still holds today. And Ireland was ruled, of course, by many kings and kingdoms. The O'D clan, or O'Days, as of course they're also called, together with the O'Quins and O'Griffins, belonged to the Fernic group. And this was also a branch of the Gaelic Irish tribe of the Dalgash. So they were related in that way to the O'Briens. They were all part of the ruling dynasty of the area. I suppose this region originally was known as Thomond. The O'Briens were at one time the kings of Thomond, and Thomond was, the old Celtic region that today covers what we now call County Clare, parts of Limerick, parts of Tipperary, made up the kingdom of Thomond. And the O'Ds then occupied the region between Paraffin and Milltown Malbay, around the parish of Dysert Tola. The annals show that throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the O'D lords were important members of the O'Brien's King's Council. So you did have a lot of connections between the two families. And the O'D Castle, which there's a picture of there, was built between 1470 and 1490. And of course, the Battle of Dysert O'D, which drove the Anglo-Normans from the region for over 200 years, took place on that site on the 10th of May, 1318. So you'll learn a little bit more about the details of that tomorrow, as I understand it. So it's a fine castle as well, the O'D Castle. And then the O'Brien's stronghold was located here in Ennis at one time. So this is a drawing of it. Unfortunately, we no longer have it. I suppose, I don't know if you're familiar with the layout of the town, but we have the old Abbey, and then we have a road called Francis Street today. Originally, it was always known as the Causeway, and that would have been, at one time, would have connected the Abbey and the O'Brien Castle on Clon Road. This is a drawing of it, but the O'Briens, I suppose, were driven westwards at when the Anglo-Normans arrived, and they established themselves at Clonroad, and that was the main O'Brien stronghold then for the next 400 years. And although there's another building on the site today, I suppose, but I mean, it did have different uses over time. For a while, it was a brewery and a workhouse, and the old castle was dismantled and the stones used elsewhere around County Clare. But it's never been excavated as a site, so there could be treasures there still, you know. And it led down, of course, the O'Briens arrived here in Ennis, and then were followed soon after by the Franciscan friars. So the friars came into the area, very little here at the time really, but under the patronage of the O'Briens, they were here already, and the Franciscan friars set up the abbey in the 1240s. And a community then grew around it really, in the town of Ennis, I suppose, grew up around it as well. I mean, it was quite an important centre here for, for spirituality, but for learning as well, the friary in Ennis. So I want to talk a little bit about maybe, you know, the culture of the clans in Ireland at that time as well. I suppose hospitality was a kind of a vital cultural institution in early medieval Ireland. And it was something that, that everybody was entitled to, not just the kings, but, even the more lowly members of society as well. I suppose in Celtic Ireland, there was a tradition of feasting, where if you want to call them the tenants of the Lord, they would pay the Lord often in food rents. And then, this food that was given to the Lord would be used by him to host quite lavish banquets, which, people would be invited to come to. And the result of this would be, that everybody would realize, what a great guy the local Lord was. So he'd be responsible for holding these feasts. And all the great kings of Ireland would have taken part in such things, especially around religious festivals, or, for the inauguration of a new king or whatever. Who's the new king? So,
I'm getting into role now.
So, and they were, you can imagine the most of the castles, and we think maybe the one in Ennis as well, would have had a large banquet hall perhaps attached to it. And they were simple enough affairs in one way, because you would have, weren't very lavishly decorated. So say the table would just be, for the king's table would be maybe a long board of wood, or they could sit on rushes on the floor. And then you would have the meat of the feast, brought on maybe on sticks. So you'd have like the fires billowing, you'd have the smell of the roasting meat and the bread. I mean, the food served at these kinds of banquets would typically be things like beef and oatcakes and dairy produce and honey. But I suppose wild pork, wild boar, that was the most prized fare at such banquets. And it would be hunted by the warriors, and I suppose depending on your rank or your status would determine which piece of meat you would get. So it was a very hierarchical society, of course, and you can see from some of the old texts, where that it was laid out where people would sit in relation to the Lord, and also which cut of meat they would get. There's an old tale from the 12th century of a magic cauldron, where you would plunge your fork into the cauldron, and whatever piece of meat you pulled out equated to your rank. So someone got the best cuts, you could pull out the snout or the tail, and so you'd be a little bit further down. But and it was quite prized then amongst the warriors. They would fight over who would get the best cut of meat as well. And I suppose, you know, this kind of ranking of food went through, all the way through society, even for children, say. So porridge would have been eaten commonly by the children of the clan, but you know, depending on the rank would determine how it was served or how it was flavored. So if you had, you know, the lower commoner child would have maybe salt added, you know, the more noble class maybe some butter to the porridge, and then the children of the king would have honey added as well. And the same with the milk that was used. So the lower grades would have porridge made with water, the middle classes with new milk, and then the kings with milk as well, but with a little extra wheat added to fortify it. So this kind of grading of society, you know, it went right through the whole of society, I suppose. Of course, at such feasts as well, the mead was the drink of choice. Honey wine, which of course is a wonderful drink that you can get often at Bunratty Castle banquets. If you've ever been out there, they serve large quantities of that, and it's a lot stronger than it tastes. It tastes so sweet and lovely. But that was the drink of choice then as well of the Celtic kings. You would have a lot of entertainment, of course, also at these feasts. And I mean, the bards, the poets of medieval Ireland were very important. The high class of poets, the Oran, they would compose poetry about the Lord, and they would, you know, entertain guests at the feasts. They actually were so high in society that they were allowed to sit by the Lord's shoulder as he ate, drink from his cup and eat from his plate. And this horrified English aristocracy who witnessed it, you know, on their travels through Ireland. But so yeah, they were quite powerful in society, the poets. The harpists as well were very esteemed, and you know, we have the harp is the symbol of Ireland, so the Brien harp, which you'll see on official government documentation or on a pint of Guinness, of course, as well. But you can see the harpists and the poets here performing for the king. Also, you have some men of sort of lesser entertainment, sort of jesters and gamesters. And I suppose, you know, bodily functions have always been amusing throughout history, and it wasn't any different in medieval Ireland, because we had the bragator as well, which were the medieval farters. And there are old texts from the 12th century that detail the bragator at the Irish feasts. And you can see two of them here, if you look carefully, over on the side there, performing for the king, maybe a little bit too close to the fire, perhaps, for comfort. And this was in England as well. I mean, around the same time, King Henry II in England had a jester. His favorite jester was Roland the Farter, was his name, and he could jump, whistle, and fart at the same time, which you have to try later, maybe, much later, perhaps. But I suppose, in seriousness, though, the tradition of hospitality in Ireland, you know, and this feasting was very important, because in many ways it kind of replaced in the European countries, I suppose, a king would display his wealth and his power through beautiful architecture and fine jewelry and paintings and, you know, these kinds of material objects. But that didn't work so well in medieval Ireland. In Celtic Ireland, it was a very, I suppose, quite a hostile environment often, and you know, there was always the threat of that these things could be destroyed. So a poem, you know, composed about the king couldn't be destroyed, it couldn't be taken away, and it probably did more to you know, promote the king's you know, his personality and his generous nature. All over Ireland, you know, people could hear about him and his hospitality. So, so yeah, in many ways, I suppose they were like the social influencers of the day, the poets.
But did not have access to time with Chris, because that would be non-powerful druids and all.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, yeah, very much. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you had that. Yes, yeah, and a lot of things were, as you say, absorbed and, you know, adopted by Christian society as well. And yeah, that hierarchical nature was no different, I suppose. Another interesting feature of medieval society, of course, was fosterage of children. And this was something that was, you know, quite common at that time. And so it goes against our idea of children and families a little bit. Today, you think of fosterage in a case where there's, you know, there's a problem maybe with the biological family and they're not able to keep the child and it has to be fostered. But back then it was done by choice, and you know, it was very much a culturally accepted practice. You know, I suppose the main reason for it was to create strong bonds. You know, the focus was very much on the child during fosterage, but it was a sort of lifelong commitment, and it had it would have affected then, you know, not just the child, but their foster family and also the child throughout their lifetime. It meant that they had more support in the future as well, and there was ties with foster siblings and all sorts also. Usually about 7 years of age was traditionally regarded as a suitable age for fostering to commence. So 7 is often regarded as the age of reason. But there are indications that fosterage happened earlier than that. There's mentions of, you know, cradle clothes being given as part of the fosterage, you know, arrangement. So sometimes very young children would be fostered out as well. Usually there was a fee involved. I mean, you could have had fosterage for affectionate reasons as well, where no fee would be paid over. But usually a foster fee was paid. And going back to the Brien laws, it would be usually done through the currency of animals or livestock. So say for a farmer, you know, it would be maybe 3 cows was the fostering fee, but for a king, maybe 18 cows was the charge, you know. And the main reason of it then, I suppose, was to educate the child. So the child would be taken into the foster family, treated as one of the family, and they would educate the child to his, depending on his rank. So there'd be basic agricultural skills taught to children, but you know, the boys from more noble class would also be taught things like horse riding or more higher pursuits like board games. And girls would be taught handicrafts, embroidery, sewing, cutting out. Those sorts of skills were very highly valued amongst women. And the foster fee that was paid then, you know, if something went wrong with the fosterage or a child was hurt during that time, that would have to be returned, you know. But I suppose beyond the fee and the education, you know, it was the ties, the family emotional ties that were most important. And for the families, you know, it made sense, I suppose, really, in, you know, what was quite, you know, could be quite a hostile environment sometimes, you know, in medieval Ireland. It was a violent world, really. The annals confirm that, and there was many, you know, killings and maimings, blindings, drownings, sometimes at the hands of your own family. So to try and create these additional bonds that would protect a child, you know, through their lifetime and forge deep feelings of sentiment with the foster parents. So it was almost like a sacred bond, which, when you think of it, I suppose, children, the relationships you form with your carers, whoever they are in childhood, can be very strong and emotional. And the same went for step children or step siblings as well, then, or foster siblings, I suppose we call them. And the children of the kings and chiefs or other distinguished persons were eagerly sought out for fostering. So, that would be particularly beneficial, of course, to, a lesser family if they could foster the child of a king. So sometimes you'd have multiple fosterings being arranged for the higher kings. Found record there, one chief, Donna O'Day, was foster father to King Torjalbach, if my pronunciation is right, Moore O'Brien, and as was traditionally the case with Irish foster fathers, was his most devoted follower during his foster son's stormy adult career. So, so they would follow the foster tie would follow all through life. And there's evidence that the O'Dees and the O'Briens would foster each other's sons as well. And Shane, I think you've done a little bit of investigation into that also.
Paddy Walden has done a little bit of DNA investigation, which has thrown up some very unusual results, to say the least. There is certainly, for some of us in the room here, quite a strong O'Brien-OD link in that DNA. So yes, it did throw up some surprises.
Yeah, that's interesting. What did you find, Paddy? Was it like very strong then?
Conor, Lord and Chiquin and Shane are close matches on their Y chromosome, which in theory should follow the surname.
Yeah.
So did the surname ever switch when there was a fostering arrangement?
Did it?
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's
So,
the most
okay.
plausible explanation we can come up with is
Yeah.
at some stage. Probably an O'Brien fostered, no, an OD fostered an O'Brien child who then took the OD surname.
Yeah.
But it could have been the other way around.
Could have been
Maybe
the other way
Lord
around.
Chiquin is really an OD.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So that's why you're the king, Shane.
We like to exchange gossips. I know John O'Day authority said that, maybe we should do it for all.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
That's all I need.
Yeah. Oh, that's so. It's fascinating, really. Yeah. I suppose quite interesting as well, just getting to the kind of the material life of medieval Ireland was the clothing that was worn also. And I mean, a lot of the, the type of clothing that was worn didn't change very much really from medieval times to the early modern period in Ireland and Scotland. And the main items of clothing was very different to what we wear today, really. The lena was worn by nearly everybody in Irish society. And it was basically a long, loose, shirt-like garment made of yellow linen, so always linen, a kind of a light yellow color, often called saffron, but saffron itself would have been very rare in Ireland. But it basically hung down to the ground, usually with quite long and baggy sleeves, especially from the 14th century onwards was the style. But then the men would hoist it up with a kris or belt, and that would be made of woven wool or horsehair or leather maybe, and you still see those around today. We used to have one at home, we must throw it out, but the kris, was something that kind of survived, I suppose, in Ireland. So that would be tied around the lena, and then the excess material pulled up and over to create, a much shorter. And you can see it here actually in the picture. So, and then the kris or belt would be hidden then with the overflap of the lena. So that was worn also by the women as a straight long garment, but then covered with guna, which is Irish for dress, guna, but it comes from the English gown. So a long, heavily pleated dress or gown, often in red or green. So, I mean, you know, they were quite colourful, really, you know. I mean, the art of dyeing was used a lot, and you know, there's lovely descriptions of medieval clothing, you know, from the old texts, which just sounds like, you know, such vivid colours, which you don't, sometimes you imagine, you know, the past to be a dark grey often, but of course that wasn't the case. So yeah, red and green dresses were the most common colour for the women. The brat was very important. This was a large outer covering made of thick wool. So you could see one there in the pink. With it often had, this was a heavy, you know, it was cold to Ireland and wet, and you know, you had to dress appropriately. So this was quite good for keeping out the cold. And so very thick wool, the brat was often made of, and it was be worn over your lena or whatever, but it often had a fringe, as you can see there, along the outside, and that could be different colours as well, and that would provide further protection for the head area. And then the copa moor as well, which was very important, which translates as great coat or big coat. That was worn over the lena, made of wool or leather. Some of those have been found in bogs actually, and still intact, you know. And they would definitely have been very useful in bad weather. The shakade, a short jacket, barely reaching the waist, worn by men as well. And actually, if I go back one, I think you'll see in the red there a nice example of that. And they were quite elaborately decorated, so different colours and details on the jacket as well. And it would also have open sleeves for the lena, the sleeves of the baggy lena to hang through, which you can see in this drawing here as well. The truce were the trousers, which could be worn in winter time under the lena or instead of the lena, and the Celts would have worn their trousers quite tight from the leg up to the thigh, and then it would be a different material from then up, maybe mixture materials or tartan or something as well. And the brogue, of course, the shoes, usually made of one piece of leather. There's an example in that drawing there, with the front and the sides curled up and a small hole added for the lace to pass through. So these were quite soft, quite comfortable, but not very hard wearing, I suppose. So you also sometimes had a harder sole attached, or they would wear sandals as well. But I suppose that brogue would be a little bit like, you know, we have the Irish dancing shoe today, might be a sort of an evolution of that. And I suppose the brat, the blanket, or the large outer covering would have evolved as well over time, and you'd see the women with the shawls in the 18th and 19th century been a evolution of the older brat. That image itself shows the Irish kern or foot soldiers from 1521, and you can see the lena and the wooden brat in that. So I suppose, of course you had the Anglo-Normans coming to Ireland as well, and they arrived from the 12th century. The English, or the Normans as they were later called, arrived, and then by the early 16th century, their control was still mainly limited to the area around Dublin, known as the Pale. So, I suppose the Celtic kings still were, in control in other parts of Ireland, and for a long time the Anglo-Normans just controlled the area around Dublin. But the 16th and 17th century saw the use of both military conquest and plantations of English settlers until the English conquest of Ireland was complete. So and there was different ways, I suppose, that this was achieved. I mean, in the case of the O'Briens, it was Donna O'Brien Murroch O'Brien, sorry, in 1543, he finally conceded to King Henry VIII of England. So he was known as the Tanist because he was one of the last of those Celtic kings to rule under the Gaelic system of tanistry. So this was where, you know, instead of the eldest son inheriting, as would have been the case under English law, it was whoever could prove themselves to be the strongest under Gaelic law. So it would lead to a lot of fighting, you know, between cousins and brothers and so on, but led to quite a strong line, of course. Also meant that this arrangement that Murroch O'Brien made with King Henry VIII wouldn't have been necessarily recognised by all the members of the clan, you know, but he travelled over to England in 1543 with his nephew. They had been granted £100 expenses and, you know, met by King Henry VIII, and in return for his allegiance to the king and his conversion to the Protestant faith, he was granted a new title. So he was no longer the King of Thomond, the Celtic region of Thomond. He was now the Earl of Thomond, and first Baron Inchiquin was another title bestowed at that time. So that system was called surrender and regrant. He had surrendered his lands and his kingship to the King of England, and the lands were granted back to him. So that, and you know, it was a good way to I suppose, to take control, was to get the local king on your side. War was expensive, and people often reverted back to their old ways afterwards. But yeah, the 16th to 17th century saw military conquest, plantations, of course, as well, which were especially successful in the north of Ireland. And of course, you had the 1641 rising and the Cromwellian War in 1649, which saw, you know, about 600,000 people killed, jailed, shipped off to slaves in Ireland, and really, you know, effectively destroyed so much culture here at that time, and would have decimated, I suppose, the ODs as well, you know, and their lands at that time also. But I suppose the strongest line then of the O'Briens continued under English law. They continued to pass the titles from generation to generation. I mean, it's now a luxury hotel, a five-star hotel, of course, outside Ennistown. Dromoland in Irish is Drum Áline, which translates as Hill of Litigation, but it was, I think, so long ago they're not sure what litigation they're referring to. But the site goes back very far as well there. It's the site of Muhaun, which is a 3,000-year-old Bronze Age hill fort. So it does have a very old history on the site of Dromoland. But there today you have different time periods of castles. There was a tower house built there in the 1500s, and a little bit of that still survives. But they also have Queen Anne Castle, that was part of that, was built in the 1730s, and then the main castle, which you see in the image there, was built in the 1830s. And it was Sir Donna O'Brien was the O'Brien that settled there more permanently in 1684. He had been actually an interesting character because he was the son of the famous Moira Rua, or Red Mary. She's Moira Rua because of her red hair. And she was a powerful woman in Ireland in the 1600s in County Clare. But Moira Rua had married an O'Brien, Conor O'Brien, and he had been killed fighting Cromwellian soldiers. And Moira Rua had then, hastily, maybe a little controversially, she had offered herself in marriage to a young Cromwellian officer, and in doing so, she had managed to preserve her large estate in County Clare intact for the benefit of her son, Donna. So the change in name, indicates the change in allegiances as well, because I suppose it was her, conformism and her desire for land seemed to influence him a lot, and he went on to become the largest landowner in County Clare. But he moved to Roland in 1684. He settled there, and he went on to have children there, and the next 8 generations of O'Briens continued to live in the castle until it was finally sold in 1962 to an Irish-American investor at the time, Bernard McDonough. He was one of the richest men in America at that time, and he very quickly turned it into a hotel and golf course. But the O'Briens kept some of the land after the sale, and they built Thomond House, and they still live, as we were saying, Conor O'Brien and his family live overlooking the estate today. And in fact, they have the O'Brien lineage, their pedigree, which goes from Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, to the current day. It's stored in a vault in Lloyd's of London. And it's a big scroll. It's 36 feet long, actually. So it'll go all the way across the room. So Game of Thrones has nothing on the plans. I just wanted to give you a bit of history while we're here as well about where we are, the O'Ground Hotel, because the O'Ground is one of the oldest buildings in Ennis. Parts of it date back to the 1500s here. The oldest part is a medieval tower house, which you can access from the function room upstairs. And it was one of the main, I suppose, fortification points for Ennis town. We're called Ennis because the Irish is Inish, which means island. That's how this town originally got its name, because we have the river Fergus flowing through Ennis, but at one time there was a little tributary off the river and it cut the area into an island. So that's where the town was founded for protection reasons. But you also had a tower house north and south of the island, and this was the one for the south, coming from the Limerick direction. And around that tower house, I suppose in the 17th century, the jail was built. So there was quite a large jail on this site at one time. Yeah, I went through different, this was quite a checkered history, because there was also a courthouse here, a town hall restaurant today, and then a manor house, and more recently a hotel. But it's yeah, quite a lot of layers of history on the site where we are. That's a picture of Moira Rua, who actually is said to haunt the tower house room here in Roland as well, because this is her castle, Lemina Castle, which was the home of Moira Rua and Conor O'Brien. But there's a fireplace in the tower house upstairs that was taken from Lemina Castle and given to the O'Ground Hotel. And there's a note apparently buried in the back of the fireplace that states that if Lemina Castle is ever restored, then the fireplace has to be returned. Now it seems unlikely that Lemina will be restored. It's very much a ruin, but they say that Moira Rua was very displeased that her best fireplace was given away, and she apparently haunts the Lemina room upstairs. Some of the staff told me they won't go in there on their own. So. But now we don't have, have we got a little bit more time, Shane, or?
Yeah. Is everyone happy for more time?
Because I just have a few more slides really. This just to show you Ennis town centre as well as it looked then around the 1820s. I mean, Ennis developed as a market town, the main market town for County Clare. And this painting was done in the 1820s by a visitor to the town. So it gives us the best kind of pre-photographic evidence that we could have of what Ennis would have looked like at that time. It's where the Daniel O'Connell Monument stands today, was at that time the site of the old courthouse and the marketplace in front. And you've got all different levels of Ennis society represented there. So the well-to-do are in the centre, and then you've got the the poor are on the outside, so it's quite a detailed photograph, but it gives you a real sense of life in Ennis at that time. Of course, the very poor were, you know, the potato people, those that survived only on potatoes, and I suppose, you know, the great famine that arrived a few decades after this painting was produced would have had a devastating impact on not just Ennistown, the whole of Ireland, and of course families like the O'Dees as well. The Great Famine would have arrived in 1845. The potato blight travelled from America originally to Europe, made its way over to Ireland during the summer of 1845. It meant the potato crops failed. And I suppose what people didn't realise was that they would continue to fail for the next number of years. And you know, none of Ireland escaped the blight, but the worst affected was the West Coast, and County Clare was quite a poor county. You know, the land here was very subdivided. Evictions were horrendous in Clare, and you know, I suppose that the population, you know, had been restricting their diet over generations. When the potato arrived in Ireland, the end of the 1500s, at that time there was only about 1 million people in Ireland. You cut to the eve of the Great Famine in 1845, there was 8.2 million people living here. And we were the most densely populated country in Europe at that time. But so many depended almost exclusively on the potato for food. So about 3/8 of the population depended for 90% of their calories on potatoes. Over the centuries, they have got rid of the traditional diet of oats and dairy, and you know, for economic reasons and for reasons of poverty, they had narrowed that diet down, so that they were already experiencing a lot of seasonal hunger and minor famines. So the Great Famine, of course, you know, you had a million people died, another million emigrated immediately, but that immigration continued for decades. They did a census in Ireland in 1901. The population of Ennis at that time was nearly half what it had been before the famine. So half the people gone. I mean, there was further famine in the west of Ireland in the late 1870s. So 78 and 79 saw failures of the crops on the west coast, which would have led to, you know, not mass starvation like Great Famine, but certainly hunger and fear. You know, people would have remembered the time of the Great Famine. So you had a lot of emigration during those decades, which actually only, you know, continued until 1966. That only then the population finally started to rise again. So, you know, you've got so many of the O'Dees living in America now and elsewhere. Because of that as well. But this is quite an interesting photograph of a famine survivor. So he looks healthy enough, but it's one of the earliest known photographs, or the earliest known photograph of a survivor of the Great Famine in Ireland. I think it was taken in 1854, so very early photography. I mean, so many emigrated to America, often on the coffin ships, of course, at, you know, in the middle of winter, which wouldn't be a good time usually to emigrate, but people were desperate to get out of here. And really it was a humanitarian crime that was committed against defenseless people. So while we were being ruled by one of the greatest countries in the world, the people suffered this awful experience. I'm just going to finish with some photographs. This is a picture of Ennis's main street, if you're wandering around Ennis, just from the Lawrence collection. So it hasn't changed much from the 1900s. So if you come out of the hotel and up the main street, that would be your modern view today with the O'Connell Monument. There's also a few old photographs of, there was recently my supervisor for my PhD produced a book called Old Ireland in Colour, which took some photographs of Old Ireland and colorized them using quite you know, progressive techniques where they work hard to get the coloring right, and they research the photograph to make it as realistic as possible as well. So I think it does kind of maybe bring those old pictures to life. There you've got some school kids in their bare feet in 1946. A couple in their Sunday best, standing outside their cottage. The Royal Mail Day car in Galway, this is 1880. We would have had a similar kind of a thing would have pulled up in front of the old courthouse in Ennis. Maybe this did as well, coming from Limerick to Galway, you know. Two Irish traveller boys from 1954, full of development, as young boys still are, of course. A fair day at Balbrickan in 1910. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Waterford tea and coffee van. And finally, a large group outside a cottage in the late 19th century. So they've all assembled for the photograph, I suppose. But who knows what they were thinking?
I think they're leprechauns, I'm not sure.
You think? So that concludes my talk. I hope you enjoyed it and you found it interesting and maybe informative or even entertaining. And enjoy the rest of your time here and the rest of your adventures tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Jane, sir. Jane. Friday, so it was Friday. Anyway, I found out so much more history, particularly of the hotel, and indeed, as you described it, the cultural and social history that permeated through Ireland, you know, back from even before the 10th century. Fortunately, a war criminal, Connell, who was extolled by his virtues in the UK, and the devastation and indeed the downfall and the decline that I suppose emanated as a result of that. And it's interesting, one particular fact that stood out for me, we didn't see our population in Ireland begin to rise until the mid-1960s. Having come from pre-famine of 8.2 million, a million dying, a million emigrating, and it in decline after that. So very sobering. But you certainly told it to us in an interesting and informative and a lovely way. So I'd like to thank you and acknowledge you for that. Food is going to be served in a little while. You're very welcome to join us, but if there's any questions from the floor, I'm sure we can take some.
Talking about the population we found, what is the current population?
Oh, well, there was a census just been done, so I think it was revealed 5.2 million. Yeah. No, not to famine levels, but it's definitely on the rise. Yeah, yeah.
It was Adrian in the famine,
Yeah.
and the total population of the Dysert was 24. So a third of the population of the Dysert lived in Ireland.
In Ireland, yeah, yeah.
So whereas the UK prospered afterwards, trying to break in
Yeah.
we didn't have an industrial revolution like what they had in Britain later decades.
Yeah, yeah. So we remained agricultural here, of course. But yeah, it's amazing.
We talked about the surrender of the O'Briens to the British, and then was there a time when the name changed just to Brien, and it is the spelling Bryan, part of that same clan?
No, I suppose that maybe the old Celtic spelling was different, O'Brien probably, but no, it's O'Brien was kind of the English version, and that hasn't changed really. So I suppose maybe those who emigrated, often names changed on emigration for different reasons, and there are probably other variants of it, but here it would be pretty much O'Brien as far as I know.
I have relatives or Northern Ireland are one.
Okay, yeah. And do they, were they in, where were they living? Are they?
Ballymoney, Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland,
Okay. I know that village came down through.
Yeah.
Francis Brien. Was, at some point, he was in Lord High Marshal of Ireland, because he married late June Fitzgerald. And I just was curious, if Brien and O'Brien.
What's the connection? Yeah, I'm not sure unless did you say there's genealogists here as well? Might be able to throw some light on it. Yeah.
I've also heard of variation.
Yeah. So there are different versions. I'm not sure how they, whether they might have been separate families originally or whether they have some connection with O'Brien. I'm not sure.
Dick, I knew you'd have a question.
No, it's not a question, just a comment. Tomorrow, really, we going out to Dysert will be, we'll look at the castle, basically 15th century Irish farmhouse and a tower house. And as Jane was pointing out, in the middle of the old round hotel, we have a tower house here, which is very similar to Dysert. I excavated here in 1999 when they were opening the Town Hall restaurant, and a lot of very interesting information. But what I would suggest to you before you leave your room, sneak upstairs beside the reception desk when nobody's looking. When you get to the top, turn left and go in and see Marlon's fireplace inside. You won't be invited to do it, but there's no one going to stop you. But you should do it before tomorrow, before you come out to Dysert. That's all I'm saying.
And it has the little O'Brien knot up in the left corner thing,
That's
doesn't
right,
it?
you're right. Now.
Yeah, if you look in the left corner, was that like a stonemason's stamp?
Yeah. It's kind of an O'Brien stamp.
O'Brien stamp.
Just to say for those of you who are going out to Dysert Castle, Dick will be doing a tour of the castle, and as I love calling it, the antiquities that surround the castle, and there are many. And Dick is wonderful at telling the stories and telling the history, so it's not to be missed. There are still tickets available to go. Turning out. So, unless there's anything else, I'd like you to raise your hands and maybe give Jane another round of applause.
Thank you.
Food will be served shortly, so I hope you hang around for this.
Everybody's here is just mentioning the relations piece.